Hello, dear patron. It is I, Chris Spangle, sitting from my back porch. Really enjoy kind of setting up the lav mic, so I'm not having to hold anything. Sitting in my backyard, chit-chatting with you, like we're just two friends sitting in my back porch, having a conversation. And I've been trying to think, what do I want to do for bonus content? As things obviously have changed over time, Harry and I have recommitted to things just get so busy now that we have kids. You know, it's, as I've talked about before, We're Libertarians was a great phase. It's not quite dead. We have the studio, the Doolittle Studios, and we're getting together once a month to do the show because that's really about what we have time for as a collective group. And I've been trying to think of what I want to do with the Chris Spangle show and bonus content and what I really want to say. And I've had a fun 3 years. Well, the first year was very torturous, as I talked about. That first year, what do I believe? I think it's interesting to see people like, I haven't listened to Mark Claire's new show, but I get the vibe from his clips that he's fairly non-political or less political or post-libertarian or something, and I've kind of seen that throughout the libertarian podcast space where guys who are very committed to libertarianism like myself kind of, I don't know, the libertarian movement has kind of fallen apart post-COVID. Those of us who are very committed to it for a decade after Ron Paul have kind of all had little crises of conscience and wondered, is this philosophy right? Can people handle it? I've never thought that they could, but it doesn't mean that it's not something that I think is morally right or something aspirational. Total self-governance without any government at all is a very lofty goal, and it's a good moral center, but I don't know that it's necessarily achievable. And, I mean, forever I've been skeptical about that and called myself a minarchist or a constitutionalist. That's pretty much still where I am, but I never was an anarchist for that reason. Hold on just a second. Squish. Yes, baby? You may fill that up. Yep. I'm in the backyard. The reason I'm doing this as a backyard conversation with you is that I'm in the backyard while my little girl plays in her sandbox. And a neighbor had a free sign on a water table, little step 2 water table that she has dreamed about for 3 years. And she finally got her water table, so she is in absolute heaven here on this 95-degree day. Feels like about 120 in the sun. So I'm in the shade talking to you while I've got an hour here to sit and chit-chat while I just kind of watch her. Did an episode earlier today on the debates. That'll be up when this goes up. So anyways, back to the point. But that first year I was like, I don't know that I'm a libertarian. Over time, I definitely am a libertarian, and I've sort of affirmed my principles, but in a much deeper way. And one thing that I've done for about 4 years, 3 to 4 years, is just intensive reading. And I do all this reading. I'm up to 32 books for the year. I actually read these books. I read more than actually what I mark as read on my Goodreads for my reading goal. I read it 2-3 hours a night. I read probably an hour in the morning. Maybe I'll get an hour in the middle of the day. And I'll read books. And my reading is kind of for the podcast. I've got all these authors on lately that I've really been enjoying. I hope you've been enjoying the show. I haven't moved away from Young Voices and kind of, long story short, the numbers weren't great earlier in the year. And I started just kind of asking around. They're like, look, I get why you can't do the panel show regularly because your wife will kill you if you have people over from 7 to 11 every Thursday night. I get that your life is different now with kids. And I get that you want to do current events, but you're not having people on who are bringing their best. Because I was just kind of putting things in the feed that I thought kind of satisfied the requirement of the podcast, which is essentially cover current events. And somewhere late spring, I said, you know what, I'm going to start putting these conversations I'm having with myself more and with my friends more in the feed. And it is less current eventy, still political philosophy, still libertarianism, still current events in some way, but currently reflects kind of where my head's at a little bit better than just sort of privately keeping that big thing to myself and covering current events that may not necessarily be all that exciting. And really it all centers around my reading. So during COVID, I went back to school. I've talked to you in a past bonus episode about my experience with Robert Vane and the pat down and my dismay at sort of losing some of the brand and losing some of my faith in libertarians, losing some of my faith in the movement while gaining more personal faith. And it's set out something that I really identified with a recent book, First Principles by Thomas Ricks. And he's like, when everything's going crazy, go back to first principles. And that's what his book is about, which is examining the first principles of the founding and what the founding generation really believed. And I loved that book. And that's part of what the history of modern politics is about, which is where did our political philosophy derive from? And that sprung from a college course that I took in 2019 on British history. But what I want to start doing in these chats, just you and I here in the bonus show, is talk a little bit more about my reading. I'm trying to be a little more concentrated about it. And I've got several goals that I'm moving towards when it comes to my podcasting output that I feel comfortable talking about, and kind of managing my input a little bit better. I think if you look at my books last year that I read, and I just think that a lot of you are readers. So if I read a lot, I know you read a lot. And books are like my favorite thing. I'm at the library like 2 or 3 times a week. I've got my wife's library card, which means I can check out 250 books. I probably have 150 checked out now. That I go to the library, I search a subject, I see what topics are out there, I get the books that look interesting, bring them home, thumb through them, and, kind of work. And I buy a lot of books on Kindle and eBay, and I don't know, I'm an intellectually curious person, and I know that a lot of you, if you're following me, you are as well. My daughter's best friend, I think, just woke up from a nap, so she's telling the neighbor kids all about her new water table. But if you look at the books that I read last year, hold on just a second. And I'm back. So our next door neighbor came over. My daughter has a little friend who is a week younger than her, and they're besties. And so we're just chit-chatting about the Lantern Festival tonight. Indianapolis is a cool place. I'm sure everybody else in cities has this, but there's a lot of little street festivals every weekend through the summer. There's always something you can go to. Irish Fest, actually that got canceled. But Italian Fest, French Fest, Lantern Fest, all that kind of stuff. So sorry about that. So I think I was saying, I've been doing a lot of reading. First, it was just because I realized I wasn't reading, and that's bad. And I've talked about why I got into it. And then it's like, if you're going to read, maybe you should read for the show, this podcast. So I read a lot of current event stuff. But, over the last couple years, I've really tried to... I realized that my education, or lack thereof, and the fact that I never finished college, I was a solid C student, always bright. If I listened, then I would be able to get a good grade, even if I didn't do homework on the test. I never really read and finished books. I was such a bad student and dropped out of college. When I went back to college for a couple semesters before life and money got in the way, I will go back, and COVID mandates just not going to college if you're going to make me get a shot, period. But, as I watch other commentators, other podcasters, especially people who have pedigree educations and PhDs, and I just have noticed the holes between my education and their education, their skill set and my skill set. And I think an autodidact like myself, somebody that is really self-taught, has a different way of approaching things than maybe somebody who has a traditional education through Columbia or Yale or WGU or Purdue or whatever, right? You're taught systematically how to think things through. You're taught the trivium, get to understand the grammar part of it, understand the basics of a book, and then analyze the book, and then use rhetoric to talk about the book. That's a little bit different than an autodidact like myself, somebody who's self-studied, self-learned, where it's a little bit buckshot. I just watched Narcos, so I'll read a book about Narcos. I watched the Sackler show on Hulu, so I want to read a book about, fentanyl. And, well, that's great because you get a wide variety of education, but it's not necessarily applied and kind of focused on exactly what I want to do. And so my life intellectually kind of breaks down in a couple different ways. I've got the Chris Spangle Show, which I really see as a project of understanding the news, understanding current events, understanding political philosophy and libertarianism, and talking about those things. And the show will continue to reflect political philosophy, libertarianism. Squish, what's up? What can I help you with?
Hello?
Talk to the people.
Hello.
Squish, what did you get today?
I got 2 things.
What?
A water table and a spinning thingy, but it has water come out.
Oh, cool. The Chris Spangle Show will, and Liberty Explained to some extent, where I'm going to be kind of investing more energy into that, will be focused on political philosophy, constitutionalism, the understanding of the American experiment, and, examining current events, and then the random stuff, whatever Harry comes up with. But we're 2 years away from the Declaration of Independence being 250 years old. And I think we're at a moment where we don't fully understand the American experiment, the Declaration of Independence. I think we have neglected that. I think that we have not... Look, I'm not Larry Arnn and the Spirit of 76 Commission or whatever the 1776 Commission to counter the 1619 project. I'm not one of those people. But, as I think through, current events, if everything is sort of fleeting, what are my exact principles? It's sort of the trivium, right? Do you understand your basic principles? Can you analyze those principles and then speak about them clearly? And, years ago when Roger on the League of Liberty was like, you don't really know anything. I certainly knew things, but I knew enough to be cute and get by, and that argument that we had really helped me to kind of go, all right, if he thinks that I'm an intellectual lightweight, is that true? And there was some truth to it in the early days of the show where I was doing it to have fun. I was doing it because I loved podcasting and I was vaguely interested in libertarianism. But over time, understanding political philosophy has become a passion of mine. And in the interviews, I'm sort of letting some of that stuff come out, but I'm not particularly at the rhetoric stage where I'm speaking about my beliefs in the way that I want to, in a clear, articulate way. And I don't know how long it'll be before I get there. But I figured it'd be more fun if I had a reading partner. And the concept of a reading partner is you read books and talk about it with each other like a book club or whatever. But, I'd love for this to be a two-way conversation, these little check-ins where I talk about what I'm thinking about, what I'm reading, what I'm working through. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you're reading. Like I said, books really have become my passion over the last 3 or 4 years. They've always been a passion. I've always collected books. I've always been a bibliophile. I've not been somebody that has spent a lot of time in them. But I'm reading a book now that kind of articulated this pretty well. There's a cool tool called Readwise that helps you keep track of your book highlights. And so you can kind of go through and take notes and highlight stuff on your Kindle or with the phone in a physical book, and then go back and look at it later. But let me see if I can find this particular quote from David Denby. So in his book, The Well-Educated Mind by Susan Wise Bauer, which is a great place to start if you want to kind of dive into the classics, which I'm doing, she quotes a guy named David Denby, whose book I'm reading called Great Books. He basically is, Denby was or is a film critic for New York Magazine or New Yorker, one of those New York hoity-toity things, and had been forever. And he realized, like, his wife was reading all the time, and he wasn't reading. He was a professional writer, but he was just sort of like reading journalistically, opening up the newspaper while she was actually like reading. And so he decided to go back to Columbia University in New York City, which has the core curriculum, which is the great classic works of Western literature, history. Think Mortimer Adler's great books, Charles Eliot's 5-Foot Bookshelf. You think Plato, Aristotle, Melville, that kind of thing. And so Columbia has all of their students go through the core curriculum, Lit Hum, Literature, Humanities, and something Civilization, Core Civilization, I think it is. And they are required to read, like, the Iliad, which is like 500 pages, and the Odyssey, which is like 500 pages, and a couple other books. Like, in a couple weeks, it's just crazy what they actually have to read. And he did it because he wanted to go back to Columbia and take these 2 classes, because when this book was written in the 90s, he did it for 2 reasons. First, it was the beginning of let's cancel Western civilization because it's racist. And he wanted to kind of gauge what students a generation younger than him were thinking. And then, his book, Great Books, is also his experience reading through the classics again, how they affected him, and him forcing himself back into reading literature. And he talked about how he was sort of stuck in the current of now. So, what, honey? So anyways, the guy realizes his wife is reading a lot, and he's not reading a lot. And he realizes, and this is in the early 90s when he writes this in Great Books, that he's sort of stuck in this stream, this anxiety-inducing, overwhelming stream of content. And he wanted to drop out of that a little bit and focus on slow. And I love that. I think it just sort of speaks to where we are and why reading is going up right now, why more books are being sold now than in a long time. Because people just are a little overwhelmed with the constant stream that doesn't necessarily help them, and they want to back out a little bit and get a bigger point of view. So that's kind of what I'm working on. It kind of articulates it pretty well. I've got to read books for We Are Libertarians, or for the Chris Spangle Show. Even I still call it We Are Libertarians. Everybody calls it We Are Libertarians, but it is the Chris Spangle Show for sure. But I'm kind of focusing on a couple different places of studying and reading. I am going back to the classics. I've always wanted to read the classics, classic literature. Just finished a few different books, kind of on the great books. One of them was pretty terrible. What was the name of it? The Whole 5 Feet. So, the concept of the great books, Western civilization literature, it really didn't come about until the late 1800s with this guy named John Erskine, who came up with this curriculum that would go on to be used at Columbia, at University of Chicago, St. John's in Maryland, and it was the concept of basically all you need to understand the world is the great conversation between generations, starting with Aristotle and Plato and Xenophon, and working our way all the way through Descartes and Marx and Kant and Nietzsche, all the way up to Cormac McCarthy now, right? And every generation takes a piece of the past generation and builds upon its knowledge and creates this great conversation. So start at the beginning and work your way forward. There's a lot about that I agree with. But the whole 5 feet is a little bit about this guy, Christopher something, eminently unlikable. I suffered through it and just basically ended up skimming through the parts that I thought were relevant. But it's about Charles Eliot's 5-foot bookshelf, which is the Harvard Classics. You may have seen it. It's like little red books or maybe some little black books that have all the classics of humanity. And Charles Eliot was this very consequential dean of Harvard who put together, he basically said any man can get educated if he read 5 feet worth of the humanities. And P.C. Collier, the publisher, went to him and said, let's do it. So they put together this set, still one of my prized possessions. My grandmother gave me her set before she passed, and it's one of my favorite heirlooms that I have from anybody. I read out of it all the time. Very influenced by it. But Erskine and Eliot kind of popularized the concept of the great classics. Now, the Harvard Classics were very impactful when they were published in the early 1900s because the people who bought them were not eggheads. It was like the great books of the Western world in the 50s and 60s, kind of criticized for midwits, for people in the term now, or middle brow, right? It's not for educated people. It's for the people who are uneducated to get familiar with these classics, because a lot of the people who bought those books grew up in places that didn't have education. They grew up on the farm, but they wanted to be intellectually stimulated. They thought that this is what the upper crust read, wanted to get a little piece of it through the 10s and 20s and 30s. And, the book kind of outlines several people who were just really influenced by, including this guy's own grandmother, who, as a woman, did not have access to the same education that U of C or Harvard person might have, right? It just gave her the intellectual outlet as a woman that wasn't available to her otherwise, which Erskine and Eliot influenced then Robert Hutchins and Mortimer Adler to create the great books of the Western world for Britannica, the encyclopedia people. I read a great book called A Great Idea at the Time about the creation of that set of great books. And same thing, post-World War II, you had a large movement of people who had been through the war, had been through the GI Bill, had gotten an education, enjoyed their education post-war, and wanted to extend that. And so through the 50s and 60s, there was a huge movement from our grandparents, apparently, for these great books clubs. There were thousands of these great book clubs across the United States where people would get together and start talking about the classics of the Western world with this particular technique where you go to U of C and their Graham College and take one of these non-accredited great books courses now, which you can do for $500 a semester. Or if you go join Columbia University like David Denby did and go through the core curriculum, you're not lectured. you are given the reading assignments, and then things are opened up to the class, and the teacher stares at them while he asks them leading questions. St. John's University is solely based on the great books. Their science programs are, Ptolemy and Newton. It's not cutting edge science. And every night on campus, or a couple times a week on campus, they have basically their version of intellectual chapel where everybody gets together and starts talking about this stuff. And so in the 50s and 60s, it was very popular to be in these reading clubs, to read through the great classics, and what are these saying to us now, and how are they informing our values? And I love it. I think it's great. I'm reading Denby's book right now. It's really interesting. Reading a couple other things about the great books, how to access them. The new Lifetime Reading Plan is sort of what I'm basing my schedule on as I'm going to start reading through these great books. And then obviously Susan Wise Bauer's book that I mentioned, what was that called? The Well-Educated Mind, also a great book to kind of get started, probably a little easier. It kind of tells you how to read, what to read, how to approach it, how to take notes, how to get the most out of it, and how to set up, your approach to some of these books. But what's the point of reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Which I just finished, 2 different versions. Is it just to be smart? Well, yeah. I mean, that's part of it. It's not so you can go on a podcast and brag about it, because I wasn't going to talk about it. But I was just sort of thinking, like, what do I want to say in this, and how can I encourage you in your reading? I loved the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's the Penguin Classics version, but I really enjoyed the Epic of Gilgamesh by a guy named Stephen Mitchell, which is kind of a paraphrasing, sort of. It was really, really well done. I mean, I finished it in a day. It's not that long. And long story short, the Epic of Gilgamesh is about this, not Syrian. See, I don't know the whole thing. Like, I can't give you the spark notes about it. But, the first civilization, the oldest poem in existence, written on stone tablets at different times through history. And Gilgamesh was this king who was terrorizing his people. He was part god, part human. And, the people pray to the gods to get the government, the man, off their back. So he sends Enkidu, kind of a synonym to him, to come and fight him and teach him a lesson. They end up in a gay relationship and fighting Hubbub, this magical creature in the forests, and then Enkidu dies, and then he goes on a grief tour and tries to find the gift of immortality to overcome death, and then ends up going back and becoming a great king. That's the long and short strokes of it. But, in reading it, you get a peek of comparing their culture to yours. What are the values and the principles contained within? And that's really what I'm after. What are, in this day and age, the values and principles that are deeply important to you, to me, to our culture? And can you lift yourself out of your own culture to go into the past, to examine theirs, to see, all right, well, maybe this isn't bad, this is good, blah, 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 right? Gilgamesh, for instance, one of the themes is a view of masculinity that isn't afraid of fear. So they're about to go in and fight this dragon that has the backing of a god. And Enkidu and Gilgamesh are coaxing each other into the forest, into the fight. And talking about how afraid they are. As 2 grown men, you'd never hear Donald Trump say, who is the, I think in some ways the American male's version of what a man is, at least over the past couple generations. wealthy, bags hot chicks, loves to hang out with playboys, playmates, famous for all these reasons, never apologize. Like, I think for the boomer generation, for our dad's generation, he is the prototypical male stereotype of like what masculinity is, for better and for worse. I'm not saying that's good. My value judgment is not that that's how it should be. I'm saying that I think the culture at large views Donald Trump as a masculine man. Would you ever hear him say, I'm really afraid of being arrested 4 times? You wouldn't ever, right? So I think that's like a contrasting value between a culture in 2500 BC versus now. Starting in on the Iliad next, I read the Tao Te Ching. I didn't get it. I thought it was lame. There's a bug in your pool. Get that yellow shovel right there, and then get it out that way. I thought there'd be more philosophy, or there's a lot of good anti-government stuff in the Tao, but I no thanks. Not for me. But one thing I'm working on is, maybe over the decade, working through the great books. Really enjoying the Iliad right now. That's up next. And the list I'm working through is the new lifetime reading plan by Clinton Fadiman, who was also a part of the Hutchins-Adler universe that helped put together the great books of the Western world by Britannica. But I thought it was really interesting that the notion of like the great books and Western civilization came about because of marketing. And this is a thing that I have learned over and over and over in my reading, is that the stuff that we think are like august and tried and true traditions were really created by salesmen in the early 1900s. And 5 generations later, we just sort of take that stuff as really important. So a piece of my reading is literature and kind of working through that. Then there's the religious stuff. Right now I'm working on Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. It's a big textbook that goes through philosophy, Western philosophy, but through a uniquely Christian eye, with J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, 2 well-respected scholars that I like. And what I'm trying to do is just get a better view of like thinking, right? So last year and the year before, I really, for History of Modern Politics, worked on reading through the history of Europe and Britain and America, and have just finished a couple books on the settlement. One book was called America by Robert Goodwin, and it was basically in the Spanish settlement of America. And, I kind of feel comfortable with the highlights of world and American history up until about 1776. Currently working on a book that's fantastic that I cannot recommend enough by Alan Taylor, called American Colonies, which tells the whole totality of American settlements up to the Revolutionary generation. So I'm kind of working on getting my knowledge. Like, I know I have heard Charlemagne, but who the heck was it and why was he important? Well, now I know. He formed the Carolingian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire and was like this consequential person. And I'm not saying I could really like hit the rhetoric part of it, where I'm speaking about Charlemagne, but I've got kind of the grammar piece of it down, like the basics. Just getting my general level of knowledge up. And now I'm adding on the philosophical and literature piece, right? So I worked on the history first to kind of get the sense of the lay of the land, and now I'm working on the ideological origins of the founding generation. And so my goal within the next couple of years is to really, in 2026, have like a lot of shows on what it means to continue the American Revolution. Why is the American Revolution important. And I don't think you can understand that without understanding the history that came before, from Romans to Greeks to the 7 Years' Wars and the War of the Roses and all those different wars between all the different groups in England and France and Germany and the concepts of nation states that came before it. Nor can you really understand without understanding Enlightenment thinkers and their particular unique place in the world, right? So, I want to understand fully the Declaration of Independence and the founding generation so that I can present that on the show. And I'm really going to kind of keep working through this with you, hopefully every week, probably every couple weeks, just talking about some of my reading and the books that I'm reading along the way that are contributing to this project. I'm also, so I've got the history piece, the literature piece, the philosophical and religious piece, the American history piece I've kind of talked to you about. I want to read a little bit. I want to read Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell in the next 3 to 4 months and finish that. And then there's the political philosophy stuff or current event stuff. I just finished Spirit of 76 by Alex Salter. I loved it. I thought it was one of the best books on libertarianism that I've read in a long time. Very short, 100 pages. I can't recommend it enough. It's books like that, books like Of Boys and Men, The Religion of American Greatness on Christian Nationalism, The Rise of the New Puritans. Those are some books that I've read that, I'm trying to... It's one thing to read literature and philosophy and history, but you do have to kind of read authors who are examining current events to understand, like, why are men in crisis with Of Boys and Men? Why does the left feel like a quasi-religious experience? What are some libertarian solutions to some of these things? So I would definitely say check some of those books out. Yes, baby.
Hello. Hello.
What do you tell them what you're doing?
Hello. I'm playing with my toy.
What kind of toy?
My toys I buyed.
Toys you buyed?
Toys we buyed.
Yeah. We didn't actually buy these. We stole these off the corner.
We didn't steal them.
That's right. They gave them to us.
For free.
Yep, they gave it to us for free. We walked by and they said, "Would you like our junk?" And we said, "Absolutely." One book that I'm still reading, Peter Conrady's Who Lost Russia. I've recommended it on the show before. Very, very good. Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western World Views from Rome to Home. That's really, really good. Those are kind of reading a book on Karl Marx. That's really good. I've got to finish Underthrow, Burning Down the House. Those are 2 books of guests that I've had that I really liked. And then there's a book right now that I'm reading called Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. Probably talk about that a little bit at a different time so it doesn't get too long. But it's been an interesting book, and maybe we can kind of go through that at a different time. That's more about how the Germans dealt with the Nazi past and how can Americans learn from that with their racial history. So I don't think I think this was a mess, to be honest. But I hope you learned something, and I'd love for you to comment in the Patreon or send me an email. What are you reading? What are you enjoying reading? Maybe if you have questions for me on things I didn't answer because this was so scattered, feel free, chris@chrisspangle.com. And, I thank you for being a patron. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting us. You help pay the water bill that allows her to fill up her little water table. And you guys are all great people because of it. So thanks so much for listening. I'll check in with you here soon. I'm sure I will be on a different topic, different book, and have a different plan because I'm very ADD. But I'm just trying to wrangle it in. All right. So here's my goals. My goal is to fully understand the American Revolution, to then chart a course for continuing the revolution, then what do I need to read to fully understand the American Revolution? History, literature, political philosophy, what? And so that's really where I'm focused. That's my goal right now. Really, it's just to get smarter to do this show. And then completely separate from all this is the Indiana history stuff that I'm working on. I got this podcast consulting business that helps pay the bills too. And I need to do some podcasts that I can send clients that aren't about politics. And I'm going to niche down into Indiana history and do some podcasts that I can use. Say, hey, it's a good way to network. It's a good way to meet some people. So I'm doing a lot of reading on Indiana history right now because I'm going to start an Indiana history podcast very soon, actually. And that'll kind of be my companion in terms of reading and education to this particular show. Liberty Explained, I'm going to be doing some shorts. I think ChatGPT and some other things kind of help open some opportunities maybe in the future to do really short, like what is this political philosophy? Who's this libertarian guy? Who's Hayek? In little 5-minute snippets. History of modern politics. Matt and I are working on it. It's just taking a long time. That's not going away. My podcast about podcasting, I do every once in a while. It's just not a huge focus of mine because it's like I work all day on this stuff. I do video editing and podcasting all day long. So it's just sort of, even though I could do a podcast about podcasting like every day and probably have some tip, and I should because I'd probably make a lot more money, it's just, I don't know. It's just, when I'm done, I want to read the Iliad. I want to read Alex Salter's book on libertarians. I want to read, The Steal, the attempt to overturn the 2020 election and the people who stopped it. Or great books by David Denby. My escape is reading. Hey, Eleanor, come here. Let me ask you a question. Come here. I want to ask you a question. What's my favorite thing to do? What do I do all the time?
Read.
Yeah. What do I like to read? About Jesus. That's right. Yes. So, your kids pay attention to what you're doing. So it's very cute. So, yeah, that's, I guess, why I don't engage in that as much as I should. So, well, with that, thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon, and please be in touch.